Thank you again, Mac. We so appreciate your leadership and you and Alana being here and the Color Surveillance Delegation being here, which we should probably start calling the Color Freedom Delegation after that speech. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you. One thing that Malkia hit upon is that the demonization, the otherization of immigrants is not just about foreign-born and native-born. It's about power, it's about class, it's about race. Each of those power structures informs structures of surveillance. Thenmozhi Soundararajan is an artist, technologist, and the executive director of Equality Labs, where Thenmozhi works to combat and reverse class discrimination and defend against surveillance. Thenmozhi will talk about those power structures, how they intersect, and how Equality Labs is mobilizing to respond. Thenmozhi.
So I think that was really a powerful thing to follow, Malkia, in terms of being able to talk about intersectionality and our vision to win. And for me, this is a topic that I'm so deeply committed to because I'm tired of being in surveillance conversations that are run by white cis men. Particularly when the technologies and the policies that have been created by white cis men are exactly how we got here. So in this piece around intersectionality, I really want to lift up the voice of Audre Lorde and this idea that even if we're here to talk about immigrants, even if we're here to talk about surveillance, there is no single issues. In many ways, our liberations are deeply connected to each other, but we rarely have the opportunity to talk about the ways that we are wedded together when we talk about surveillance and the U.S. settler colonial state. And for me, I think that part of when we talk about intersectionality, we really have to bring our whole selves. And I have to say that for me, it was incredibly difficult to be here today because I could not get over the heartbreak over Nabra, the young woman that was murdered and raped, and whose death is not seen as a hate crime, but as an act of road rage. I was thinking about the verdict of Philando Castile and, of course, the death and the murder of Charlene Lyles. And this idea that impunity is so deeply the part of the surveillance state is really something that we need to talk about, because there is no rule of law in this country for black and brown bodies, because the law is used to control black and brown bodies. So in that context, for me, I think it's really important that we learn and start to shape our strategies for resistance, whether it's about the technology we build or the coalitions that we grow through this frame of the intersectional. And a lot of times I think, when people talk about intersectionality, they're like, yeah, I know race and class and gender, they're all interconnected, woo. But then when we start to build the work that we want to do together, somehow we start to see the replication of structures of power and who gets to build those visions. And I think that in many ways we have to look at both the intersectional nature of the history of surveillance as we try to move forward to vision beyond the surveillance stalker state. I think also what's really important about when we take an intersectional frame to surveillance is we move beyond the Bill of Rights. Because too often a libertarian frame around surveillance centers the idea that the people that are the most concerned about surveillance are white men in hoodies that feel like they are the ones that are the most surveilled. And in many ways, the Bill of Rights really only ensured privacy for white cis men who owned land. And that's really the core of the understanding of the U.S. settler colonial state. Because in many ways, when we talk about surveillance, we have to talk about empire. And that's one word that we have not seen and heard enough in this space today, because whether it's the idea of manifest destiny and the destruction of indigenous peoples in the United States, or the war on terror today, surveillance is a tactic of the state, and it's a tactic to control black and brown bodies in order to be able to extort land and labor and other resources. I think for me, when I also think about the violence of Manifest Destiny, I have to continually emphasize the fact that it is a tactic of state violence. And so whenever we try to center the conversations around the technology, we're not really naming the fact that this is a conversation of trauma. And I'm sure everybody's body language over the course of this day started to get more and more and more crinkled, because we know we have lived through this violence for so long, and we often only talk about it in terms of the violence, not in terms of our resilience. And so intersectionality is also a call to the understanding that we are here because our ancestors fought this for many, many, many years. Not all of us survived, but we have that knowledge of resilience to be able to get us through this time. I also think that part of that resilience is really rooted in the fact that we have to center the voices of those that are most vulnerable to surveillance in the conversations and strategies as we move forward. It is unacceptable to have a panel that does not speak to and have Muslim women on it when talking about surveillance, that is talking about undocumented people without undocumented people in the same space. And we do not need research studies that do not have a co-design model with those communities in place. Because what we see knowledge being created without those communities is knowledge that's not actually being able to be used and often replicates bad frames. The other thing is that we can't talk about immigration without talking about the violence of against indigenous peoples. And in a U.S. settler colonial state model, we don't talk about the fact that we are all migrants. We talk about the fact that empire allowed certain people to be migrants, trapped other people to be migrants, but we all built power under the frame of empire by colluding and supporting the decimation of indigenous peoples. And core to this was actually the corralling and the controlling of indigenous bodies and lands and tribal properties. So we have to center indigeneity as the first conversation around migrants before we talk about the condition of immigration and surveillance. The other thing that we need to talk about is that the U.S. settler colonial state built its surveillance on the plantation slavery surveillance system. And this image is the image from lantern laws that Black and indigenous slaves had to carry the technology of the time, which was the candle, in order to illuminate where they walked at night so that people would know that they were not going to organize. And I bring this image up because too often when we talk about immigration and surveillance, we always talk about the fact that, but we were good immigrants. We weren't undocumented immigrants, or we weren't criminals. And this idea that some people are criminals and some people are just accidental attacks of surveillance is an important binary we need to remove, because that conversation is deeply rooted in anti-Blackness. Because from the beginning, the people who they saw as criminal were the people they wanted to extort the most labor and resources from. So we have to get rid of those divisions and stop saying there are good people to surveil and there are bad people to surveil. The other thing that we need to look at, which is not something we've been able to talk deeply about today, is the way that queerness and gender figures into surveillance. And I just wanted to pull up this image, which came from this period in the 1950s about the Lavender Scare, where they talked about how homos were spying for Russians. And in a deep, disturbing way, when we talk about the lack of conversation about the way queer folks and trans folks are being surveilled and have been surveilled for a very long time, we are missing another frontier of the conversation and another group of people that can actually lead us forward in this moment. And this was another part of this which was so disturbing. But I think the other thing that we need to do is we need to center the trauma, but we need to highlight the resilience. Because many, many, many times, and as with the Quality Labs, we've trained folks across the country, as soon as you talk about digital security, you are the person that people really want to talk to, but they dread the most. And I think it's because we don't name how much trauma is centered around this. But every time there's been an attack against our community, we have been resilient. And I think many people find a lot of power from the Chinese Exclusion Act resistance. So yes, there was deep xenophobia and violent imagery that came at that time. Yes, there was intrusive measures, as we heard about today. But I think the thing that was so powerful with that is that one of the reasons that the Chinese registry did not work was because the Chinese community en masse said they would not register. And the fact that so many people know a little bit about the act but don't know that it was defeated because of collective effort is a negligence in terms of the way that we are taught our history for liberation versus being taught for us to be continually oppressed. So it's upon us to be able to work as movements with historians to lift up the violence but lift up the power as well. I think also what's really critical for me is thinking about the story of COINTELPRO. And for folks that don't know about COINTELPRO was one of the largest domestic surveillance programs against social movements. And this was not known to us as an American public because of the benevolence of the FBI. It was revealed because we had activists and lawyers that broke into the FBI office and then released it anonymously. And this is really important at this moment as we see whistleblowers being targeted and being seen and charged for federal crimes, that in many ways, at this time when we have a white supremacist fascist administration, we must not collude, we must not normalize, and we must fight with whatever means that we have possible. The other thing that I think is really important is we rarely talk about poor people when we talk about surveillance. But access is a deep part of understanding who are the other groups that are surveilled when we talk about the surveillance state. One thing that I think very few people talk about is the way that welfare and the families that receive welfare are part of the surveillance state, and particularly how this is part of the conversation in terms of gender and surveillance. When you receive welfare as a woman, you have to talk about the partner of your children. You may have to submit for drug tests, and there are continued behavioral intrusions to who you are and that you exchange in response to be able to receive that welfare. There's also this piece around the Obama phone, which was one of the fights that was won related to Lifeline. And what people get when they get an Obama phone is 250 minutes of free talk time, but also unlimited surveillance of where you go, what you talk about, and your texts. There is no negotiation about that surveillance conversation because poor people don't get choices. And yet, rarely have I ever been in a surveillance conversation where this massive program, which affects over 20 million people, is ever highlighted or brought about, or that anyone has actually done an analysis on the Obama phone. This is kind of where we start to see the blinders, where the lack of intersectionality is really dangerous, to where we're seeing surveillance in plain sight, but not really mapping the power that we need to be able to fight it. The other thing that I think we need to talk about is why resistance needs to be transnational. And we heard today about the CVE programs that are happening domestically. But I think what's really important to understand is CVE is a program that the United States operates not only in schools, not only here domestically, but also abroad through a US aid programs. And that in order to get some U.S. aid programs, you have to mandatorily go through CVE screening procedures. And this is where we simply cannot talk about CVE as a way to prevent good Muslims from bad Muslims. We need to talk about how we're domesticizing the war on terror and how these connect up to questions of empire and how dangerous this is. So when you are an organization that works with immigrants, but you only have an American perspective to what we're seeing in surveillance, you're not seeing the whole problem, and you're not tying into the possibilities of large-scale transnational resistance to this very violent frame. The other piece is that a collective defense is our only option. So I'm Dalit American. I come from a very small community in the United States, but we are 300 million people in India. But I think one of the things that's been so powerful as people that offer digital security in the United States is we came to this resilience because people supported our movement in India. And I think what I've found is not only do we need to share our analysis together, but we need to really be able to build our strategies of resilience together. So that means going into discomfort. It means asking hard questions. It means struggling with people. And this is not something that's going to happen on a social network platform. In fact, I think Facebook is the worst place to have those conversations. But we need to deeply do this now before those platforms get shut down completely for those of us that are holding the front lines. I also think we need to be visionary and not reactive, which is incredibly hard. But in many ways, I don't think what we want is a better surveillance system. We want an end to state surveillance. I think what we want is not a sort of good neoliberal empire. We want the end of empire. And to be that big of a visionary means that we have to not let violence determine our choices. It means we can't let trauma shield our vision. And we need to be brave enough to know that beyond this violence, we can still dream. And I think that's the hardest thing to retain in the face of this violence. Many of us are dealing with communities that are being disappeared. Many of us cry at night. Many of us have a hard time even holding it together. And a lot of times what I tell people is that this is your permission to be a hot-ass mess at this moment, you know. But you also have to ask for help and know we are in it together and we have to stay strong together. And I think this question of no ban, no wall, sanctuary for all is still a question we need to think about better when it comes to digital security and surveillance. And in many ways, like, what do we want? And how do we want to understand borders in the context of our freedom and our visioning and our imagination? So I think that for me, Equality Labs has been one of those places where I've been starting to think about that work. But I really want to invite all of you to use the time of this conference, not just to feel afraid, but to have permission to use that fear as a door to an opening of a larger movement. And to take time to build with people, to be frank and sincere at this time. When you need help, ask for it. But most importantly, know that we are going to fight, we are going to win, but only if we bring our whole selves and our whole movements together. So thank you.